Some people say like ADHD is my superpower, right? Mm-hmm. That provides a lot of creativity.
Yes.
That creates a lot of opportunity for people to look at things in ways that, quote unquote, neurotypical people would not look at. And so some people say, hey, my ADHD, my thoughts that come in and, someone's talking about this and I jump to this thought and then I jump to that thought. And the next thing I know, I'm coming up with all sorts of very interesting, solutions to it. That can be helpful for people.
Greetings and welcome everyone to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Excellent as always to have you along. Today we're going to be talking about ADHD, a topic that's really a household term. And to have this conversation, I'm really excited to have Ted Witzik Jr. with us, a psychologist, and Aaron Plattner, a psychiatrist. And I think these two brothers will offer a great deal of insight as we consider ADHD. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, good to be talking again.
I mentioned there in the intro that ADHD is a household term. And really, we have, I would say, a really good grasp of it at the younger ages. Most of my career has been in education, right? And so knowing who has ADHD and how we acquiesce that in the classroom, and so we have this context for what this looks like in the maturing individual, and how do we service this maturing individual who experienced ADHD. But I'd like to pivot the conversation because Les has said in the mature years. And so how then do we support the ADHD individual in the mature years, I think is a conversation that I think is a very welcome conversation. And I know both of you every day deal with and have the opportunity to service and to support individuals with all manner of disabilities and trials and difficulties, and ADHD is one of them. So does that intention hit to the both of you?
Thanks for having us on today. Most people, when they think of ADHD, they think about it in children and teens, and that's where it shows up. But there was, for many years, a thought that it was something that people just grew out of, and that it was a childhood disorder, and that it didn't go into adulthood. But today, we know that many adults continue to have ADHD symptoms. And if those are, sometimes they're never diagnosed or not diagnosed as children, and so they're being first diagnosed with it as an adult. Other times, people had been diagnosed as a child and adolescent, but now as they come into their adult years, have to adapt as well.
I think that's really helpful, just to even hear that historical perspective. And again, we've kind of started saying everybody does know ADHD. Aaron, what does ADHD stand for? And perhaps provide some of the medical background to kind of undergird an understanding of ADHD.
Sure. So when we think about ADHD, that is an acronym for, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. We know that a lot of us are more aware of that hyperactivity part, right? That's the young kid who can't sit still, maybe very fidgety, or just very impulsive, right? This is the person who might kind of blurt out an answer, or when you're supposed to be at a store, they're maybe climbing on things or just kind of all over the place. Now, when we think about that as a youth, this kind of comes back to that frontal lobe, the front part of our brain here. God has given us a frontal lobe that is larger than the other creations that he has made, right? And one thing about humans, created in God's image, we are really unique in the fact that we exist in community with other people that are not directly related to us. Termites live in community, but they're basically just clones of themselves, right?
Sure.
We are not.
They all have the same mother.
Yes. And I'm sure you have examples of beehives and how they work together, but they don't have these huge differences that we as individuals, as humans have. And so how do we navigate the differences of each other? Well, that's where that frontal lobe plays a role. It is essentially the brakes that we all need in our lives. So when James says to be, slow to speak and quick to listen, in a way, that's that frontal lobe of hey, just slow down, right? Let the person finish. And so that frontal lobe if you see someone such as a football player who's been hit multiple times in that frontal lobe, they will have more periods of aggression, more periods of agitation, more periods of impulsivity. That frontal lobe has been damaged. But someone with more of an ADHD, we can see that the frontal lobe is not as well developed, both on scans, which comes back to more of a dopamine, right? And I know we've talked about dopamine in other podcasts, that dopamine is the neurotransmitter which makes the brain communicate that is that kind of pleasure seeking, right? And we also have norepinephrine, which is another neurotransmitter that also has to do with that frontal lobe that kind of helps put the brakes on. So when we think about people with ADHD, as I talk about them kind of doing all these hyperactivity things, in a way they're stimulating themselves. They're bringing that level of dopamine up to a level that allows them to function. But by doing that, they're able to raise that level of dopamine so they're better able to function in the interactions with each other, which means they're in some ways putting the brakes on. So they're not as impulsive as far as like interrupting. They're able to sit still for longer time periods, or they're able to wait in line longer for the drinking fountain, these sorts of things that help us engage or interact with other people.
This is really a matter of importance because we're relational.
We don't expect, for example, we don't expect 5-year-olds to have the same level of impulse control and brakes and things like that as we do somebody that's 10 or that's 15 or that's 20 or that's 25. And we know that that brain development is continuing throughout that time. What happens is that over time with kids that have ADHD versus those that don't, is that earlier on, they'll tend to be sometimes more similar to their peers because their peers don't have as good of brakes either, right? But that over time, some of that gap it widens. And then they get in trouble more and things of this nature. One other thing I want to say here is sometimes people will use the term ADHD. They do it a lot with other categories like OCD as well. And so if somebody forgets something, or they do one thing out of order, oh, that's my ADHD. Or if somebody likes their pencils put in their, on their desk, right? Well, I'm so OCD. We have to distinguish the way that the words get thrown around from an actual diagnosis. And that's something that Aaron and I will take very seriously with people, is because we want to treat people for the right things.
So I've got just a yes/no question, but feel free to elaborate. There is evaluations and you can have a diagnosis. A 60-year-old man comes in and says, I wonder if I have ADHD. There is a path forward to having a clinical diagnosis. We've got the test for that. Is that yes or no?
Well, so there is a way that we would go about assessing that. What would you say to that, Aaron? I would say yes, but I would.
Yes.
It's kind of at 60 years old. It's going to be quite a journey.
So, Matt, often people will come and say, I think I have ADHD, and that will be their chief complaint or chief concern coming there. I can do what is a clinical diagnosis, which is asking questions and answers and determining, is this more of a pure ADHD or is this an ADHD-like condition but caused by other conditions? So, for example, if someone has generalized anxiety disorder, one of the diagnostic criteria is poor concentration. But that's also a diagnostic criteria for someone with depression. So you can see how psychiatry, there is a lot of symptoms that overlap each other. The other option is that ADHD can exist alongside or with another condition that is separate, but those two conditions together can make each other worse, such as someone with like a learning disability. Right? They might have dyslexia. And so as they're trying to focus, but things are getting flipped, right? That makes it even more hard to pay attention. And it's more difficult for them to work through their dyslexia. So you have to address both at the same time, but understand they influence each other. So that would be the one in the clinical way, but often there's also a more of what we'd say is a neuropsychiatric or neuropsychological testing where you can actually go to a testing center or someone who's a specialist and they will give people actual tests. Some of the tests are a self-scale where the person circles yes or no or rates himself on a scale, 0, not much, 10, significant, and they'll rate themselves on how they self-report on their symptoms. And they can also give that scale to, I'm sure as you were a teacher, you might have gotten some of those scales to report on kids in class or their parents and families.
how important is it to, I mean, you mentioned, Ted, we throw around that term a lot, and we, as kind of the end of a joke, oh, this is who the way I am, ADHD. But I hear what you're saying is that there is a sacred use of the term, and it should be honored as such. How important is it for somebody with suspicion to really to know?
So I really, of course, this is the field that I'm in, psychology. We specialize in giving some of those tests, and that's one of the things that we do. So my bent is going to be toward doing some of those inventories and doing some of the tests to see, for example, if we can pull apart which pieces are working correctly and which aren't. So, for example, it's very possible for somebody to have average intelligence or even strong intelligence, and yet because they have ADHD, they get a lot of slippage, and so they might think they're dumb. Okay, for example, and to be able to know where somebody's abilities are, where they're currently functioning, and then we can actually try to target interventions towards them, both in the school, medically, and in terms of counseling. If somebody, for example, when we do these tests, has anxiety that shows up, we want to treat that, and we want to treat that whole person. As was said, we oftentimes, the diagnosis is oftentimes with a kind of a cluster of information gathering. The person's self-report, other people who observe them closely, and then also kind of their history. Because with ADHD, the symptoms have had to start in childhood. ADHD, by its nature and by the way the diagnosis is written, is a neurodevelopmental disorder that starts in childhood and shows its way along.
Yeah, and that's helpful, Ted. And I could see your opinion there is that if a person is wanting help, that's really the kind of square one. If a person is wanting help with a certain matter, then knowing what is playing out and what is behind the scenes and what is going on is of utmost importance to you. And so perhaps looking into ADHD and whether it's present or not is a part of good care.
Sure. It's just important that I'll call it a rule out approach as opposed to a rule in approach. If you say, oh, you know what, I forget my keys sometimes, I must have ADHD. Well, that's a rule in. That's like saying, I did this, so I have this, versus being able to say, okay, that may be one thing. Is it part of a cluster of things? And is that due to anxiety? Was that due to a stressful work week? Or is this something that shows up over time?
So I've got a question, and it has to do with this idea that for quite a while now, we've had ADHD on our radar as it concerns kids. And I think, Aaron, you really laid out why that's the case. They live in a very structured environment in school. Like, it manifests itself when you've got straight rows and times where you need to be quiet, and this is when you listen. I mean, it's going to just explode, and the teacher is dealing with disruption. And so all of a sudden we've got a problem to solve, and hey, ADHD is a part of this issue. And so we have provided a great deal of support for that individual with ADHD in the younger years. My question now is, what does it look like in the life of an adult? What now are the matters of crisis that's saying, you know what, we need to find some answers here? And then what does it look like to provide support? It seems to me this is a landscape untended, whereas the young classroom has been attended now for a long time. Say more about this adult space.
So I do think that, like you mentioned, classically we see it in kids, and parents are going to take different approaches. Some includes medications, some include different environments. The kind of beauty of getting older is that you aren't restricted to this narrow, like you mentioned, classroom. You can do all sorts of different jobs. And so some people say, like, ADHD is my superpower, right? Don't see it as like non-attention, see it as like so many different things coming at the same time. It's hard to go with which one you're going to kind of stick with, but that provides a lot of creativity.
Yes.
That creates a lot of opportunity for people to look at things in ways that, quote unquote, neurotypical people would not look at. And so some people say, hey, my ADHD, my thoughts that come in, and someone's talking about this and I jump to this thought and then I jump to that thought. And the next thing I know, I'm coming up with all sorts of very interesting solutions to it, that can be helpful for people. And so some people would say it's not attention deficit, it's attention different, or it's an inability to weed through all these different options. Because if that dopamine is more stimulated, once again, oversimplistic, it can specify on the one thing to move ahead. So if someone picks a career that creates a lot of stimuli, they're always being stimulated, it's going to be helpful for them to kind of focus on what they need to do or not do. So you can see people with ADHD that tend to kind of gravitate more for athletics. You've got a quarterback, there's a lot of sensation coming in. They've got to put a lot of input and make a decision, go quickly. That stimulation can be helpful. Or, someone who maybe is just at a job where it's a lot of movement, like an electrician who is looking at the house and moving around. That can be much more helpful than someone who's at the stereotypical desk, with a cubicle. That may not be a great fit for someone who struggles with attention, right? So as an adult, you can see people find different careers that are better for their difficulties. However, as people get older, we do see that hyperactivity slow down as far as the physicalness, but we don't see that hyperactivity of the brain necessarily slowing down. So it's one thing to lose, you forget your lunch at school and mom needs to bring the lunch and you have to get hot lunch, right? If you're moving ahead and you've got all these things going on and you forget a very important, business thing, it's a lot more weight to that, right? Yep. And if you haven't found the structure of, people with more of attention deficit, they lose things, right? It's not that they do it on purpose, but they're coming home from work and they've got many things of what they want to do and it's going through their mind and they just kind of put their keys there. And when someone asks, where's your keys? Their thoughts are already way beyond that. And so they kind of lose their keys or they lose their checkbook, right? That's a little bit bigger deal as an adult to lose your checkbook than a kid losing their homework. So what I see, and this is when do you treat or not treat, right? There is the whole psychiatric and the DSM, right? That it has to be causing significant difficulties in your life, right? And so if you think about someone in a relationship, and it tends to be more men than women as we think about ADHD. So that's why I'm picking the husband. If you think about the husband versus the wife who are raising kids and have a lot of bills to pay and all these things going on, there needs to be a certain teamwork of handing the baton back and forth, right? But if the person can't maintain the baton and do what he's been asked to do or remember it or forget it, that can cause a lot of stress in the relationship, which causes the wife to say, you're not, are you listening to me? They're probably listening, but their mind's going different places. And so it may not appear that they're listening to their wives. So the communication part might not be there. There might be the forgetfulness. And then, the wife needs to cover for him, where the person's able to quote unquote sit still, but they're not able to kind of have that engagement and communication, filling their roles either at work or with the family. And that can put a lot of stress in which sometimes it's actually the spouse saying you need to help my husband because he's putting a lot of stress on this relationship and I need help.
Thanks, Aaron. I love the fact that Aaron brought up that it's important that we see and find ways that we can see people's strengths. We're oftentimes treating disorders, but the flip side to that is we want to help people to live their best, whatever that is. And so creativity and spontaneity can be really fun also, and a really good thing. But when that turns into things that lead to relational problems or job problems or forgetfulness that goes beyond what an employer can deal with, or those kind of things, then we get into trouble. A big part of this is understanding that people with ADHD have a will that they can exert and make choices. That's important to understand. The flip side is that this is not all about will. Okay? And family will sometimes look at it and say, if you would try harder. Okay? And in one sense, yeah, trying is a part of this. So don't hear me that it's not trying. But the other part of this is it's not just about trying harder. And I think that is probably one of the reasons that the diagnosis and getting that is so important, because otherwise we'll just kind of treat it as a matter of will or selfishness or whatever. Now, again, somebody with ADHD could be selfish, and somebody with ADHD might not try as hard as they need to sometimes. But the flip side is that's true of all of us. And we don't want to just say that this is just about just trying harder.
I appreciate that, Ted. And I'd like to ask you again, to give us some ideas of exercises, perhaps things that you would do in the room as you work with people with this. Certainly, Aaron, there is a medical approach to this. I mean, you've mentioned dopamine and other neurotransmitters, and you've explained medically what's going on here. And so I think it's easy for us to make the connection that says, I'm guessing there's some medication here that could be helpful to this end. But Ted, you spend your time on the therapy end of things. Is there one thing to say, two things to say that say, you know what? If you have ADHD, try this, or this would be something that we would look at in terms of practice.
Yep. So as we look at the package of skills, okay, that we're going to use, we're going to, and I'll let Aaron talk more to the medications end of things, but I'm going to look at it through three main lenses that I'm going to try to help the person with, okay? One is that in a therapy context, I'm going to try to help them to understand good coping skills. That can be social skills, that can be skills to help them to get their self-esteem in a correct place if they felt less than. It's going to also try to help them keep anxiety and depression lower, those kind of things. I'm also going to teach them things like relaxation skills and being able to quiet themselves at times. Those things don't naturally occur. We're going to do it in a way that works for them. So that's coping skills is a big part of it. Number two, some of the lifestyle management skills, getting good exercise, sleep, those kind of things. We know that with that extra energy and things like that, but also just moving and keeping that brain healthy is really important. So brain health is a part of this. Getting sleep problems go hand in hand a lot of times with ADHD. Eating well, again, the concept here is if they're just dysregulated and they're just, going super high on caffeine or just eating trash, whatever, we're creating other swings in the system. We want to create a good health base for that. The third thing that we're going to focus on is relationships. So it's coping skills, the lifestyle management, and then relationships. And with that, it's about the social skills. It's about having people in their life to help them, to have cues and to coach, and to develop in their own home or businesses the ways that we work together to make things work. Make sure there's good relationships, communication, but also too, sometimes it's helpful to have somebody who is actually a coach. And what I mean by a coach is sometimes it's somebody at the workplace or whatever, but there are people who are ADHD coaches or organizational helpers. And again, this isn't about a one-time fix, but it is about some of that lifestyle management things to help with the social coping. So
I really appreciate that, Ted. And what I hear is that you really take the approach that says, okay, so this is the way your brain processes the world. Mm-hmm. You can live with this well, mm-hmm. but it's going to take some things to learn.
That's right.
These are the skills. Aaron, medically, what should we know?
There are definitely things we can do. And I do hear the question of, isn't it just these iPhones and screens and, we're just raising this generation and this, culture that's, exacerbating all of this attentional deficit. And there's no doubt that, the screens are changing our brains. And we do know that ADHD does have a genetic component. There does seem to be in the history a very clear indication of people who have ADHD in their family, and that is passed down. So we know that genetic component is there. So coaching, when I come in the house, here's a place I put my keys, very specific structure, those sorts of things. Those can be very helpful for people with ADHD to do the things that they need to. But the gold standard is still medications. So you really split it up into stimulant medications and non-stimulant medications. So the non-stimulant medications would be like a medicine called Wellbutrin or bupropion or Strattera or atomoxetine and some others that can work with the norepinephrine, which is once again that brake in that frontal lobe to say, slow down, slow down, think it through. That's where the norepinephrine can kind of help put that brake on. But then you have the stimulants, and you're right, you have the Ritalins and the Adderalls, which are the two classes of medications that actually work on that frontal lobe and increase the level of dopamine.
It's just important to remember that two people can have ADHD, it can look very different, okay? But what we want to do is, if somebody is concerned about this, we would encourage them to get an assessment and that looks at all these different factors we talked about, and then to get treatment that looks at these different factors too. How does their brain work? How is their relationships working? Their coping skills, their lifestyle, all those different pieces. And then as they grow and develop, as they go through life, to try to figure out the best kind of settings to be able to work in and to thrive in.
I think that's really helpful. And, I'm really super intrigued by the environment that really elevates the presence of ADHD. You mentioned the classroom for the young child. You mentioned the cubicle for the worker. Let's go to the church space. Let's go to the spiritual space. I hear, even as you walked through the coping skills, Ted, the lifestyle, relationship, the calming, the relaxing, the quieting, sure sounds a lot like prayer. Sounds like read your Bible, come to a church service and sit and be quiet. This is a setting that there is, and I'm wondering what we see in this spiritual space, because I can imagine it's got to be very discouraging for a person sincere and wanting sincerely to live out their faith and have their attention going in 1,000 ways. And we kind of have this kind of sense, and I'm not even sure how accurate it is, but that the spiritual person can focus on the Lord. So anyway, what can you share for those who want help in this spiritual place, connecting with God and otherwise?
Yep. I think this is true for ADHD. It's true for other situations as well, when people have learning issues or whatever, is that we have to figure out how to do this, how to make it work well for us. And so, for example, when we come in and sit down in church, and for many people, their minds can move faster than the minister is speaking, okay? That's not true of every minister, but for many ministers, it's true. So one of the things is, normally what we do is just like pace ourselves, remind ourselves to focus and things of that nature. But somebody with ADHD, you might find, for example, it's good for them to also have a note card or a little something that they can take notes in, so that they're listening and writing and kind of going back and forth. Again, church service is about an hour, so we're not talking about that they have to maintain it forever. But I think the other side to this is sometimes spirituality is kind of like that. Those that are the most studious, those that are the most book smart, are most spiritual. And we just need to remember that people can live that out in a lot of different ways. Yes, we want to get the word into us, but maybe this person finds an audio Bible really helpful. Maybe they find doing something that's more of a devotional, kind of like a reading that has kind of a plan that they can follow, or doing that with another person. Maybe they find that sitting and reading is going to be hard, but serving the Lord by being able to bless others in certain ways are going to be really a way that they can live out their faith. So we're just trying to help them to be able to see that they are an important part of the body of Christ, and to live into that and not to be discouraged by that. Aaron, thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think the beautiful thing about the Gospels is how Jesus meets people where they are.
Yeah.
He has this ability to say these things that just kind of meets him right there. But as he approaches different people, his approaches seems to be across the board. And so I think we have this kind of, this mind. I remember as a kid, my grandparent had this, picture of this old man praying with his Bible, and there's a piece of bread as is our daily bread. And so you've got these Instagram, devotion time with like a cup of coffee and their Bible. And it's just this kind of solitary sitting there. But at the same time, I have a neighbor who she walks and prays. I know this because I've talked to her, and she sits there, and as she's praying, the next thing she knows, she's going over her, grocery list and what she needs to do and balancing her checkbook. So for her, going for a walk helps her stay focused and concentrate, and she needs that stimuli. And we have so many different ways that we can consume spiritual things, such as, audio Bible where you walk or something like that. So I do think that we need to understand that God has given many different gifts and availabilities to meet him in his presence. And so someone with ADHD might find that it's more helpful for them to be engaged in these kind of activities. I do think the sitting and receiving the word as we do traditionally on Sundays at Apostolic Christian Church is a very wonderful way to receive. But I know for others, they enjoy small group conversations of Bible studies where there's more talking and engaging, and they're more actively learning, and they find that is something that is able to help them supplement the more traditional service where they're sitting still. And so I think that we can find where people are at and try to meet them there, that they can once again, bring that attention to an appropriate level and be able to better receive or understand with their thoughts being present, the word of the Lord.
Great.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Aaron. Really appreciate it as we brought this matter of ADHD, well understood perhaps in youth, but so present in adults also. And I really loved how we touched on not only the medical or the biological matter, also the relationship, social, how it impacts that, our emotions, and then now lastly, and maybe most importantly, spiritually, and that God has made a way for us to worship him in all of our uniqueness, I think is really exciting. Thanks, both of you, for being on. Bless you, each one who's listening, wherever you're at, and we pray and trust that this has been helpful for you. God bless you, each one. Thanks.